My family ditched my daughter's birthday feast, so I turned their betrayal into her biggest triumph ever, and then. It's strange how one moment can stick in your memory like a splinter you can never quite pull out, and for me, that moment is the way my daughter Madison looked at me that chilly spring morning in Louisville. Bright-eyed and flushed with a hope that was so fragile I wanted to wrap it in bubble wrap. Madison had just turned 16 2 months ago, and if you met her, you'd understand right away she's not the kind of kid who ever does things halfway. She is obsessed with food the way some kids are obsessed with gaming or fashion. And her idea of a relaxing Saturday is developing a 5-course meal based on whatever's growing in our backyard. Her passion for cooking is not some passing hobby, but more like a mission she's determined to fulfill, even if it means waking up before sunrise and poring over French pastry books while her friends are out at the mall. When she told me, standing in our cramped but warm kitchen, that she wanted to cook every single dish for her grandmother's 65th birthday party, I didn't hesitate, even though I should have expected how messy it might get, knowing my family. My mother, Janice, has always loved the idea of hosting grand celebrations, but only if they're perfect and Instagram ready, and my dad, Ted, has made a lifelong sport out of pretending to keep the peace, when really he just avoids every hard conversation. My older sister, Brooke, for years my senior, is the family's golden child. She always seems to float into a room trailing a breeze of parental approval behind her, in every family milestone, from her dance recitals to her Ivy League acceptance, is still spoken about as if the world itself paused to watch. I have long ago stopped wondering why my own accomplishments, like building a small but honest home decor business or keeping my family afloat after my husband's job was lost, never seemed to rate more than a pat on the head or a comment about Riley just being practical as always. It's not that I'm bitter, okay, maybe I am a little bitter, but I've gotten good at hiding it, and mostly I try to focus on Madison and make sure she knows I see her. That morning, Madison handed me a menu she designed and printed herself, every dish chosen for a reason, because Grandma can't eat gluten, because Uncle Graham hates onions, because Cousin Elise loves lemon in everything, and as she talked through her plan, I saw a spark I hadn't seen in her in months, not since she got rejected from her first-choice summer culinary camp. The thing about Madison is, she doesn't just want to cook. She wants to prove herself to people who don't even know they're the audience, especially her grandmother, who thinks of cooking as a job for real chefs, not teenagers who watch too much Food Network. I tried to hide my worry as she listed out the schedule, shopping for ingredients on Thursday, prepping on Friday, marinating chicken and slow-roasting brisket, making 3 different cakes in case someone didn't want chocolate. Madison even designed the table settings, complete with hand-drawn place cards and paper flowers she'd learned to fold from a YouTube channel that specializes in party crafts. It was the kind of attention to detail I knew my mother would either secretly appreciate or, more likely, dismiss as a bit much. I pulled out my phone and scanned the family group chat where Janice had just sent a cheerful message about how excited she was for her special day, along with a passive-aggressive reminder that everyone should wear something nice because we want to look good in the photos. Brooke had replied within minutes, boasting about the dress she'd bought for the occasion and joking about needing a stylist on retainer to keep up with all these parties. I typed out a message letting everyone know that Madison would be handling the menu and would need some help setting up the tables, but as usual, the only response was a thumbs-up emoji from Ted, probably sent while half-watching a baseball game. It always falls on me to do the work, make the calls, coordinate the details, figure out how to make things happen with a shoestring budget while my parents act like hosting 30 people in a suburban house is as easy as boiling water. Madison and I went grocery shopping at dawn, stretching her savings and my emergency fund to cover specialty cheeses, organic produce, and enough butter to fill a small swimming pool. She spent the whole day baking test batches and scribbling notes in a battered notebook, muttering about emulsification and flavor balance in the same breath as she stressed over the seating chart. Late that night, after Madison went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee, scrolling through messages from my sister asking if there would be any vegan options for her new boyfriend, who is a little particular, and my dad wondering if we could avoid making anything too spicy. I wondered, not for the first time, why I kept letting them treat us like the family support staff, quietly competent, invisible when it counted, expected to deliver, but never invited to take a bow. Then I looked at Madison's careful handwriting on her planning sheets, and I knew it wasn't about them at all. It was about making sure my daughter felt seen, even if no one else saw her the way I did. The next morning, the kitchen was humming before sunrise, filled with the scent of herbs and caramelized sugar. Madison's apron already smudged, her hair pinned back with the same determination I recognized from the old pictures of myself before I learned to bite my tongue at family dinners. My phone buzzed all day with texts from family members updating RSVPs, making special requests, or reminding me not to overdo it, as if overdoing it were something I could afford to do even if I wanted to. Brooke messaged a selfie from a salon, her hair in curlers, her caption about being party ready, making me roll my eyes so hard I nearly sprained something. Ted sent me a message at noon asking if I had remembered to order enough ice, and my mother chimed in an hour later to ask if the tablecloths were up to standard. At 5 o'clock, after 3 days of work, every surface in the kitchen was covered with finished dishes, covered in foil or carefully garnished, each one a tiny act of rebellion against the idea that a 16-year-old couldn't possibly handle a dinner party. Madison changed into her best dress, hair curled, cheeks pink from the oven's heat, and smiled at me in the hallway with that jittery, pre-performance energy you see in Olympic gymnasts right before they stick a landing. I watched her adjust the placement of every plate, her hands trembling just slightly, and I wanted nothing more than for someone, just one person in this family, to notice her effort, to say something kind without a qualifier at the end. We took photos together before anyone arrived. The table set for 24, candles flickering, Madison's menus lined up with perfect spacing, and for a moment, I let myself believe this could finally be the night she'd get to be the center of something good, not just the silent worker in the background. Looking back, that hope feels almost painful now, knowing how quickly it all unraveled. But at the time, all I could see was Madison's nervous smile and the way she looked at the door every few seconds, waiting for the first knock, and I kept telling myself that sometimes families surprise you in good ways, not just bad ones. I didn't think anything could break my heart faster than watching Madison's face when she realized that no one was coming. But the way it all unfolded was so abrupt, so cold, that it felt like the kind of scene you see in a bad TV drama. Except no one yells "cut," and you can't turn the channel. I was standing in the archway between our kitchen and the hallway, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid, watching the sunlight catch on the glassware and thinking how proud I was that we'd made something beautiful out of so little, when my phone buzzed in my hand with a notification from the family group chat. My stomach dropped the instant I saw the preview, a wall of text from my dad, because nothing good ever comes out of a family group chat at 5:30 on a Saturday. I tapped the message, praying it was just some last-minute request for extra napkins or a warning that my mother's friend Nancy was bringing her annoying dog. But the words that stared back at me were simple, final, and impossible to misunderstand. Change of plans. Everyone's meeting at Pritchard's Steakhouse instead. Adults only. Sorry for the short notice. For a second, I honestly thought maybe it was a joke, or maybe Ted had lost his mind and was sending the wrong message to the wrong group. But then my phone started vibrating again. This time, photos began appearing in the thread, pictures of my family already sitting at a long table, menus open, wine glasses clinking, and Brooke's 2 kids grinning at the camera, definitely not adults, but apparently exceptions to the new rule. I felt the room tip sideways around me, a wave of dizziness that made me grip the edge of the counter, desperately trying to remember how to breathe as the rest of the details snapped into place. Madison's name cards lined up along the table, the lavender-glazed chicken she'd fussed over for hours cooling in the kitchen, the cake she'd piped with trembling hands now waiting in the fridge for people who weren't going to come. I swallowed hard, not trusting my voice or my self-control, and called my dad before I could think better of it, staring at the family photo he'd just posted as the phone rang. He picked up sounding infuriatingly cheerful, like he was just calling to chat about the weather, and when I asked if they were really not coming, he sounded almost confused at my question. "We just figured it'd be easier, Riley," he said. Like moving a party for 24 people at the last minute was the same as swapping out side dishes. No need to make a big deal out of it. You know how your mom gets about food safety. Better for everyone this way. His dismissal was so casual, so practiced, that I felt an old ache bloom in my chest, the same one I'd learned to ignore growing up as the kid who always came second to Brooke. I tried to remind him that Madison had spent 3 days cooking for them, that she'd woken up at dawn to make every detail perfect, but he just chuckled and told me to tell her not to take it personally. He was already at the restaurant, already settled in, not a flicker of apology in his voice. And then he hung up because the waiter had arrived to take his order. The sound of that call ending in my ear made me want to throw my phone against the wall, but I held it together long enough to dial my mother, praying for some scrap of understanding or regret. Instead, she picked up like nothing was wrong, her voice smooth and unbothered. And when I asked why she'd changed the plan, she cut me off before I could finish. We just didn't want to take any chances, Riley. You know Madison's sweet, but it's not really safe to feed that many people homemade food from a kid. And anyway, it was easier this way. It was the same old script, delivered with a sigh and a bored undertone, as if I'd asked her to solve a calculus problem instead of acknowledging the effort her granddaughter had put in. I tried to argue, reminded her that Madison had taken food safety classes, that she'd checked every allergy and sanitized every surface twice. But my mother brushed it off, saying that homemade was nice, but not like a real restaurant. And besides, no one wanted to be a test subject for a teenage cook. My hands were shaking so badly by then that I had to set the phone down on the counter. And for a moment, I just stood there, staring at the gleaming kitchen and the mountain of untouched food, wondering what in the world I was supposed to tell my daughter when she came around the corner asking if the napkins were folded straight. Before I could even catch my breath, Brooke called. Not because she was worried, but because she'd already seen the messages in the group chat and didn't want me to make a scene about the whole thing. She lectured me about not guilting everyone and said Madison was being dramatic, that she'd learned not everything is about her. I wanted to scream, wanted to reach through the phone and shake her, but instead I hung up mid-sentence and tried to steady myself. I could hear Madison in the other room humming as she finished plating the appetizers, blissfully unaware that the party had been canceled without her. And the thought of what was coming made my vision swim with anger. A few minutes later, Madison wandered into the hallway, clutching a tray of sugar-free lemon tarts she'd made for her grandfather's neighbor, humming quietly, and when she saw the look on my face, she froze. She asked if the pomegranate glaze was too tart, if she should warm the bread again, and then her eyes flicked to the phone in my hand. She took it before I could stop her, scrolling through the group chat and then stopping cold at the newest photo. My entire family, gathered around a table at Pritchard's, laughing and clinking glasses, my mother beaming as she raised a toast. Brooke's kids waving for the camera. Madison stared for a long time, face frozen, then she hit call and dialed her grandmother. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw her face crumple, saw the tears gather and slip down her cheeks one by one, silent and heavy, until she finally handed me the phone and retreated to the kitchen. She didn't sob or scream, just moved through the motions, checking the oven, wiping the counters, holding herself stiff and small. I followed her, wanting to reach out, wanting to find some words that would make any of this less cruel, but I couldn't speak around the lump in my throat. Madison asked if we should throw it all away, 24 dinners, 3 cakes, all those hours, and I knew if I said yes, she would do it, because she trusts me to know what's right. I told her no, not this time, not after everything she'd poured into it, and I promised her that if her family didn't want her food, someone else would, even if I didn't know how yet. For a while, we just stood in the kitchen together, the clock ticking loudly, the house echoing with the kind of emptiness that feels bigger than silence. It wasn't until later, when I tried to distract myself by cleaning up, that I saw the new charge on my business credit card, over $1,000 at the very same steakhouse where my parents and sister were now eating. Proof that they hadn't just erased Madison's effort, but had actually used my own money to fund it. I let out a sound that was half laughter, half something much darker, and I knew then that I couldn't let them have the last word. Madison, still in her party dress, was sitting at the kitchen table staring at her hands, and I realized the only way forward was to make sure she knew, no matter what her family thought, that what she had done mattered, even if it was just to me. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I kept replaying the scene in my head, every detail sharper and more humiliating than the last, and all I wanted was for Madison to forget what had happened. But as I walked the house in the dark, I knew that erasing pain wasn't possible, and maybe it wasn't even the right thing to wish for. Madison wasn't just disappointed. She was gutted in a way I recognized too well, the kind of heartbreak you only feel when the people who are supposed to lift you up are the ones who cut you down. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by untouched platters and a cake that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and I realized if I did nothing, if I let this moment pass in silence, it would become another wound she'd learned to hide. That was the last thing I wanted for her. So instead of letting the food go to waste or letting my daughter shrink into herself, I started making calls. I didn't have a plan or even a list, just a determination to fill the house with anyone who might appreciate what Madison had done, anyone who could remind her that her talent wasn't invisible. I texted our neighbors, people I barely spoke to except for the occasional wave from the driveway, and asked if they'd eaten yet. I called an old friend from college who lived 2 blocks over, a single dad with twin boys who were always hungry. I reached out to Madison's science teacher, Mrs. Porter, who'd once told me my daughter was the only student she'd ever met who could explain the Maillard reaction better than a textbook. My desperation didn't allow for embarrassment, so I messaged Zoe's mom, Zoe being Madison's best friend and co-conspirator in countless kitchen experiments, and told her there was enough food for an army and she was welcome to bring her family. To my surprise, people came. At first it was just our neighbor, Mr. Dale, carrying a bottle of cheap wine and wearing the look of someone who hadn't had a home-cooked meal in months. Then came Mrs. Porter, her hair still wet from a rushed shower, apologizing for showing up in sweatpants and bringing a box of bakery cookies as her contribution. Zoe's mom arrived with a bouquet of tulips and a shy smile, and then Zoe herself came barreling through the door, hugging Madison so hard that for a second my daughter almost smiled. The kitchen filled up faster than I thought possible, laughter and conversation echoing off the walls in place of the silence that had settled like a fog earlier. People set down dishes, pulled chairs from the garage, and started serving themselves from the platters Madison had arranged, oohing and awing over every bite. Someone turned on music, the kind Madison liked, and soon enough the house sounded like a celebration, not an abandoned party. Madison hung back at first, hovering by the oven, hands twisting in her apron as if she were bracing for criticism. But as the compliments poured in, one neighbor marveling over the roasted duck, Zoe's little brother devouring 2 slices of lemon cake in under a minute, I saw something begin to thaw in her. Mrs. Porter called out that the rosemary potatoes tasted better than anything she'd had in a restaurant, and Zoe's mom whispered to me in the hallway that it was the most generous thing anyone had done for their family all year. Slowly, Madison allowed herself to believe what she was hearing, slipping into the dining room and starting to answer questions about her menu, her cheeks pink with embarrassment and pride. The biggest surprise came about halfway through dinner when a woman I didn't recognize showed up at the door. She introduced herself as Julia, a food writer for a local lifestyle magazine, and explained that she'd heard about what had happened from a friend of a friend, Zoe's mom, as it turned out. Julia asked if she could try Madison's food and maybe ask her a few questions for an upcoming feature about young chefs in the city. I nearly said no out of sheer reflex, worried that any more attention would overwhelm my daughter. But Julia was gentle and genuinely curious, taking notes and snapping a few discreet photos of Madison's dishes. By the time dessert was served, the dining room was buzzing with energy, and for the first time all day, Madison looked like she belonged at the center of it all. Someone stood up and made a toast to her, praising her creativity and perseverance, and everyone else joined in, raising glasses of lemonade and wine to the 16-year-old who turned heartbreak into a feast. I stood back, letting it all wash over me, and felt something inside me let go, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. This night, which started as a disaster, had become a kind of rebellion, proof that love and effort don't always go unnoticed, even if the people you hope will see it never do. When the last guest left, I found Madison in the kitchen, tired but glowing, her hair escaping from its pins, hands sticky with icing and pride. She hugged me tight and whispered thank you, and for the first time in days, I believed things might actually be okay. We curled up together on the living room couch, plates stacked in the sink, and I promised her that this story would not end with being left behind. The next morning, everything felt surreal, almost peaceful, until my phone started buzzing before sunrise with notifications I didn't want to see. The article Julia wrote went live overnight, and by 8 a.m., it was everywhere. A heartfelt, unflinching piece about a 16-year-old girl who'd poured her soul into a family meal only to be abandoned by her own relatives. Julia hadn't named anyone except Madison and me, but the details were unmistakable. References to Janice's birthday, the canceled party, and the lavish dinner at Pritchard's Steakhouse paid for with someone else's credit card. The comments section exploded, dozens of strangers reaching out to say they were heartbroken for Madison, calling her brilliant and brave, while others condemned the unnamed relatives as monsters for treating a child that way. Before I could even finish reading, my phone rang with a call from Brooke, her voice strained with outrage as she demanded to know how I could have let this get so out of hand. She didn't want to talk about what happened, didn't want to apologize, only wanted to control the fallout. She insisted that I issue a statement clarifying that no one meant to hurt anyone, as if a carefully worded apology would erase what Madison had felt. I refused, and Brooke's anger turned to threats, swearing she'd make this right with the rest of the family. It didn't take long for Janice and Ted to show up on my doorstep, Janice wearing her favorite pearls, Ted trying to look stern but clearly just tired, and Brooke trailing behind, all of them pushing their way inside before I could tell them no. They came at me all at once, voices overlapping, my mother demanding that I fix the narrative and blaming me for their ruined reputation at church and among their friends. Ted kept shaking his head, saying this was all a misunderstanding, while Brooke tried to play the peacemaker but couldn't stop herself from snapping that Madison was too sensitive and I was too dramatic. The whole time, Madison stayed in her room, listening through the door, probably wishing she could disappear. When Janice finally said that Madison had embarrassed the family for attention, something inside me snapped, and I found myself stepping between them and the hallway, refusing to let their shame poison her again. My husband, who'd been quiet through all this, arrived home in the middle of the storm. He took one look at Janice's twisted expression and Ted's defeated posture and told them to leave calmly, firmly, no negotiation. For a moment, I thought they might refuse, but something in his voice told them this was the end of the conversation. Brooke tried to play her final card, threatening to call a lawyer, but she sounded more desperate than convincing, and I could see in her eyes that she knew she'd already lost. Ted muttered about family sticking together, but Janice just glared at me, spit a final, "You'll regret this," and stormed out with Brooke in tow. As soon as the door shut, I sank onto the floor, trembling from the adrenaline and relief, and Madison came out from her room, eyes red but face set. She hugged me without a word, and I promised her again that we were done letting anyone else decide our worth or our story. That evening, Julia sent a follow-up email saying her article had been picked up by a national site and that a few local chefs wanted to connect with Madison. We got messages from strangers offering support, from other kids who'd been hurt by their families, and even from a chef in Chicago who wanted Madison to stage in his kitchen over the summer. In the days that followed, the house was quieter but lighter, like a storm had finally passed. Madison spent her afternoons updating her food blog, responding to messages from people who wanted to learn her recipes or commission her for events, her confidence growing with every kind word from outside our old circle. My parents moved to damage control mode, telling everyone who would listen that they'd been misunderstood, but it didn't matter, too many people had seen what really happened, and no amount of spin could cover that up. I blocked Janice and Brooke from every platform, deleted their numbers, and made sure my business credit card was locked so they could never use it again. Madison never asked about them, never seemed to wonder if they'd apologize, but I knew she still felt the ache sometimes, the sting of being cast out by people she'd wanted to impress. Still, we found something close to peace in the aftermath, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the world on my back alone. The strangest part was how much support poured in from people I barely knew, old friends, internet strangers, local business owners, Even a retired chef who wrote Madison a letter saying she had more courage than most adults he'd met in his life. We didn't celebrate, exactly, but we learned to exhale, to let ourselves be proud, to believe that family can be chosen and respect can be earned on your own terms. Madison started applying to culinary programs she once thought were out of reach, not because anyone told her she could, but because she'd finally learned she didn't need permission to chase what she loved. And as I watched her cook, laugh, and create again, I realized our story wasn't one of loss. It was one of finding something better, together, after everything else fell away. A year passed, and in that time, I watched Madison transform from a heartbroken teenager into someone almost unrecognizable, confident, focused, and even a little bit daring. She threw herself into her passion, entering local food competitions and posting every recipe to her growing blog, her photos getting better, her writing sharper, her voice finally finding its audience. When she got accepted into a culinary immersion program in Boston, one she used to call a pipe dream, I cried with relief and pride and 1,000 other emotions I couldn't name. She left for the East Coast with a suitcase full of kitchen gear and a head full of new plans, texting me pictures of her first chef's whites and the tiny apartment she shared with 2 other girls from the program. There were days I missed her so much it ached, but I never let her see that. My job was to stand back and let her fly. About 3 weeks into the program, Madison called late at night, her voice vibrating with excitement. She'd been scouted by a regional cooking show, a televised youth competition filmed in Chicago that could mean a scholarship and internships if she made it to the finals. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but I could hear the hunger in her voice, that same stubborn determination I'd watched grow in our kitchen all those years. The day of her first taping, I drove up to Chicago and sat in the audience, my heart pounding through every round, watching my daughter work under the cameras and the judges' eyes like she was born for it. She breezed through the first 3 rounds, her signature lavender butter cake drawing praise from a chef who'd once owned a Michelin-starred restaurant. And when the final episode was set, Madison was one of just 2 contestants left standing. The day of the championship, my phone buzzed with a call from a hospital I'd never heard of. Janice had been admitted after a stroke. For a moment, the old reflexes kicked in and I nearly stood up to leave, but something in me stopped. I looked across the room at Madison, hands trembling as she prepped her station, and I realized how many times I'd put her last for people who never gave her a second thought. I sat down again, my chest tight, my mind spinning with guilt and resolve. The cameras rolled, the clock counted down, and Madison finished her final dish. A take on roast duck and root vegetables inspired by the meal she'd made the night our family turned their backs. When they called her name as the winner, she started to cry, and I ran to the stage and held her, not caring about the audience or the lights, or even what was waiting for us back home. The next morning, we took the train back to Louisville, silent except for the click of Madison's phone as she responded to congratulatory texts. I kept checking my email, expecting a message from the hospital or from Brooke, but there was nothing, just a quiet, empty inbox and the steady hum of the train. When we got home, a small brown envelope was taped to the door. Inside was a faded photograph of Madison and Janice, taken on a sunny day in our backyard years ago, the 2 of them smiling, heads together, in a rare moment of real affection. There was a note in Janice's careful script, written before the stroke, short and raw and nothing like her usual tidy formality. She apologized for the things she'd said, for the parties missed, for not knowing how to love a daughter who was nothing like herself, and for teaching me to measure worth by what other people thought. She wrote that she'd seen Madison's name in the paper and realized, too late, that courage sometimes looks like standing alone. Enclosed with the note was a cashier's check made out to Madison, enough to cover her next 2 years at culinary school. I stared at the check, my throat tight, unsure if I was supposed to feel forgiveness or just relief. I showed it to Madison, who turned the envelope over and over in her hands, but didn't say much, just tucked the letter away with her old menus and chef's coats. We didn't talk about Janice's stroke or the note, or what came next. Madison threw herself back into cooking, her ambitions now bigger and bolder. Pop-up dinners, private catering, even a workshop for kids who wanted to learn to bake but didn't have the money for fancy classes. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window at dusk, her face shadowed and unreadable, and I'd wonder what, if anything, she felt about her grandmother. I realized then that some wounds never really close, but if you're lucky, they stop hurting so much over time. A few months later, on a rainy Thursday night, I opened my email to find an invitation from a well-known TV producer. Madison had been nominated for a National Culinary Rising Star Award, the kind that comes with sponsors and media attention and a place on a list she'd once only dreamed about. That same night, I got a call from a local lawyer letting me know that Brooke and Ted had quietly sold their house and moved to Nashville, apparently tired of the cold shoulders from neighbors and friends who'd read Julia's article. I wondered if they'd ever reach out, but deep down I didn't expect it. Instead, we celebrated Madison's new future with pizza and store-bought cake, the two of us in our living room, windows rattling from the storm outside, laughing until we were breathless. The following weekend, I got a second envelope in the mail, this one from a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a single photo of Madison, torn from the newspaper coverage of her cooking show Win, and a scrawled message, "Don't ever forget what you're worth." There was no signature, but I recognized Janice's handwriting. I stood in the kitchen holding the letter, the whole house quiet except for the sound of Madison laughing from her bedroom. And I knew that some stories don't end with perfect closure, they just find a new beginning. We never heard from Janice again after that, but the check cleared, and Madison started planning a new chapter of her life, one written entirely on her terms. Sometimes I walk past the dining room and see the table set for two, sunlight glinting off the silverware Madison insists on polishing for no reason other than it makes her happy. I remember the night she was left behind, how small she seemed, and I realized that loss isn't always something to mourn. Sometimes it's just the space you need to grow. If you had told me, a year ago, that we would come out the other side stronger, I would have laughed in your face. But here we are, just the two of us, with more love and laughter than I ever thought possible. And for the first time in my life, I don't care who sees it or what they think.